Do you ever wonder about last names? I do. I wonder how someone got their last name, where it came from, where did it originate? Why were they given that name? You could guess. I mean, you could assume, make up some elaborate story. But at the end of the day, most of us don't really know where our last names originated from. Unless you come from, lineage that had been around for centuries or were very prominent, well-known figures. But in general, I don't think we really know. I can't say that I am curious enough to research all the last names, but I'm still curious. So that's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode. It's last names. This story is about a family whose last name changed forever after the Civil War. But the funny thing about this story is that the family always knew that there was some action that made their last name today what it is, but they never really knew why. Several stories have been told over the years, very dramatic and heroic stories. But at the end of the day, it wasn't all that dramatic. But the thing that's incredible about this story is, one, we're able to trace back exactly where that change happened and why. And two, that it literally changed an entire family's last name for over 5 generations and going. Hi, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. This is the story of Margaret Kightlinger and her fight for survival during the war, after the Civil War, in order to take care of her family, her children, and herself. This is her story. Margaret Kightlinger was born Margaret Allen in 1841. She married a man named Jesse Kightlinger in 1858, and they lived in Crawford, Pennsylvania. And at some point lived in Warren County, Pennsylvania, although it's unknown when they shifted. Jesse was born in 1838, and at the age of 21, he joined the 145th Infantry Regiment from Pennsylvania to go and fight for the Union during the war. He enlisted as a private and remained in that rank for his duration. So August 1862, he probably went into town, signed his name on the paper on the table, and that was it. Off he went. So Margaret, a young wife, young mother of 2 children, her son Lorenzo and her daughter Viola Eva, were left at home to take care of themselves. We don't have much information about where they lived, what their home life was like. Did they have a farm? We don't know. But what we do know is that in 1860, Jesse was listed as a laborer. So they were not well-to-do. They were the common folk who were generally poor and did not have a lot of money or a lot of land or status. So Margaret is at home with her children, surviving during the war, as most women did. There wasn't much that they could do at the time other than just try to take care of all the work, minus an extra body to help out, pray for the safety of their loved ones, and unfortunately, like many others, have to fend for themselves when the troops came knocking at their door to take over their homes as headquarters, hospitals, perform amputations in their bedrooms. There have been accounts of just piles of limbs being out in people's front yards because the troops would take what they could and they would make camp where they wanted. If you had silver or anything of value, they would take it. They would take your livestock. They would eat your crops. And you were just left there to watch it all happen. And once they left, you were left destitute. There were not a lot of professions that were available to women during that time. Most women were raised for domestic life, and that's what they did. Farming, taking care of the family, children, cooking, so forth. So outside of that, you were destitute and starving and trying to figure out a way to survive. Now, we can't say that happened to Margaret, but that was the general climate and life for women during the war, especially in the South. So Jesse is fighting for his country. His regiment ended up seeing several battles in Virginia specifically, and those battles were pretty large scale. They fought in the Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg Battle, Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia, Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Bristow Station, Virginia, Auburn, Virginia, Battle Wilderness of Virginia, Spotsylvania Courthouse, also known as Bloody Angle, Cold Harbor, Virginia, which is south near Richmond, and Deep Bottom in Petersburg, Virginia. Now, Deep Bottom actually had 2 battles, and after surviving all of those battles, where slaughter was horrendous across both sides, Jesse ends up becoming wounded on August 14th in 1864, towards the end of the war, in Petersburg during the Second Battle at Deep Bottom. He was shot in the leg. It was eventually amputated, and he died from his wounds. Now let's take a step back. Most of the soldiers who died during the Civil War either died from disease, hypothermia, or they died from bacteria infections called gangrene. And if you were wounded with a gunshot wound, most of the time you would have that limb amputated because they didn't have antibiotics back then. Surgery was hard. They were already doing it on wooden tables in someone's barn. And 2, they didn't have any way to treat it without it becoming infected. Unfortunately, amputations caused infection and people eventually died anyway. So it was not a guaranteed cure, and you can imagine using the same saw to cut off one limb and throw on the next one. It was horrendous conditions. But for Jesse specifically, being shot in the left leg wasn't bad enough. From Petersburg, the nearest hospital was Campbell Hospital in Washington, D.C. Now, if you're not familiar, that is approximately 130 miles north of where Petersburg is. So they would have loaded him up on this wagon ambulance pulled by horses, and up a dirt road, 130 miles he would have gone. This wagon, as it's rocking back and forth, feeling every rock it runs over. He eventually gets up to Campbell Hospital, and he ends up dying on October 7th, 1864. Funny enough, the family story that had been passed down from generations was that he died in Libby Prison, which was in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a prison for Union soldiers captured, and it was a horrible prison. So I think maybe for the family, being shot in the leg wasn't heroic enough, wasn't as exciting. So anyway, that was the story, but we have now proven that that is not true, and he was just shot in the leg. So back to Margaret. Jesse dies, and he eventually is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where he still is today. Margaret is still up at home in Pennsylvania, probably now wondering what she's going to do. I can imagine her feelings as a woman. She was only married a few years, so she probably felt like she was robbed of that time with him. But then also, what does she do? She's at home. She's got 2 kids. She can't just go pick up a job and start working to earn some money. And we don't know what her life situation, he was a laborer again, so I'm sure he didn't make very much. What does she do? Women in that time, a lot of them, if they didn't have a young man that they could marry again, a lot of them resorted to marrying men that were 50 years older than them. The ones that were too old to fight or, had been injured. But women resorted to what they could. And unfortunately, a lot of times it was not an ideal happy ending. But thankfully for Margaret, that's not the case. We end up finding out that she remained in Pennsylvania after Jesse's death with both of her children, and she ended up remarrying a man named John A. Goss. He was a Canadian, so he didn't fight in the war. But he was also about her age. He was born around 1840, somewhere in Canada. We're not sure how they met, or if they knew each other beforehand, or if they met later, but around 1864, between 1864 and 65, she got remarried. I didn't think much of it. except that as a war widow, Margaret was able to file a pension against Jesse's death, to where the government would provide some funding for her as a supplement. And on that pension, she lists John Goss as the children's guardian. And she filed that September 20, 1865. And it's listed that in 1870 on the census, he's 40 years old and was a carpenter by trade. I'd like to think that he came from Canada when the war was over to visit Pennsylvania, fell in love with its beautiful landscapes, met Margaret, and they lived happily ever after. But who knows? Maybe that's true. We know the family, his last name is Goss. Clearly, the children took on John's last name. If after 5 generations later, they went from Kightlinger to Goss, he adopted them as their guardian, and they grew up with him as their father. And he must have been an influential figure in their lives, because Margaret's oldest son, Leonard, ended up taking the Goss name and really officially ending the Kightlinger lineage through that branch. And Goss carries all the way through from 1865 to today. So Margaret and John remarried, and they end up moving to Titusville, Pennsylvania, where John ends up becoming an oil refiner. And they live there for several years and have several other children. But sadly, Margaret died at an early age. She died at the age of 57 in 1903 from tuberculosis. There wasn't much on her daughter, Viola Eva, and there's been misconceptions on whether she died young or lived later, but we were able to find that she did, in fact, she got married and ended up living a full life. John Goss ends up living until 1908, and he actually worked for John Schwartz, which was an oil refiner there in Titusville, Pennsylvania. John ended up dying from abdominal tumor. Was based on his death certificate. And like I said, Margaret died from tuberculosis. Eva ended up living a full life and married a man named Elmer Ettinger. And she moved to Buffalo, New York. She lived until 1941, ended up outliving her brother, Leonard. Leonard died at the age of 77 in 1941. Now, the Titusville Herald in 1903 listed Margaret's obituary. It's a testament to who she was and her character. It says, the death of Mrs. Margaret Goss, a well-known woman, passed away at her Central Avenue home, wife of John Goss, died at the family residence late Tuesday afternoon. The disease-causing dissolution was tuberculosis of the lungs. Her illness was long, but it was not until the last Saturday that she was compelled to seek her bed. She was born 57 years ago and had resided in Titusville about 35 years. Her husband was an oil refiner at one time and was last employed by John Schwartz. The family was well and favorably known throughout the city, and Mrs. Goss was a woman with an extensive acquaintance. She was kind and charitable, often willing to surrender her personal convenience and comfort for the benefit of those less fortunate than she. She was a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church, a Christian woman loved by her family and admired by her entire circle of friends. Besides the bereaved husband, she is survived by several children, and she was buried in Greenwood Cemetery, where John would follow her 5 years later. But this story is extraordinary because it captures life for women during the Civil War and how the death of a husband, of a father, of a fiance changed their courses forever. So many men died during the war that there were very few young men left. And the ones that came back home, a good portion of them were incredibly disabled from either missing limbs. PTSD is not something that was talked about or known then, but I have no doubt that was very prevalent. So Margaret did what most women had to do. Thankfully, this was a happy ending story for her. But the cool part of this story is that this man stepped up to be a father for these 2 children, and it's changed a family's history forever. And the nice thing is that we have an opportunity to see what kind of person she really was, that she was kind and charitable. Even living through what she did, she was still there to help other people. That's who she was. And it's a real testimony to the legacy that she leaves behind. I hope you enjoyed this story. Until next time. For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.